Cosmopolitan is a loaded concept for good education and perhaps for a prestigious business school like Wharton of Pennsylvania. President Trump graduated from here. Cosmopolitan is an important value in shaping an inclusive process of globalization. Professor Geoffrey Garrett, Dean of the Wharton School, says in my interview in Philadelphia that his school welcomes Chinese students and encourages shared perspectives. Sitting exactly in the seat of Benjamin Franklin, founding father of the United States, I'm wondering aloud what kind of leadership American education institutions may deliver and what leadership means for the future of our two countries. I believe the 4th US-China Summit in the University of Pennsylvania may address this issue and whether engagement would be sustained, at least in the business community, despite the aggressive unilateralism. Today we are so delighted to be joined by Professor Geoffrey Garrett, Dean of the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and I feel so honored to talk to him right in his school here in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
I'm so happy to see you again, and I've enjoyed your hospitality in Beijing. I'm glad I can reciprocate in Philadelphia.
By the way, this is a journey of learning for us, the group of Dialogue. My first question is very much about this event that brought us here, the 4th US-China Summit. Given the mounting tensions between the two biggest economies, do you think such a strained relationship would make a difference to this summit, the 4th of its kind?
I don't think it'll make a difference to the summit because the people who are involved in US-China relations, not only at the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School, but actually in universities all around the US, share exactly the same view, which is that at a time of tensions between the two countries, the most important thing we can do is to keep sharing perspectives. So I think the importance of the event, if anything, has gone up. But in terms of the tone, I'm sure it will be supportive, open, engaging, all the things that we hope for on university campuses, and I think we need in international dialogues.
You know, this is the most important message that I can probably take home to share it with particularly those who are involved in educational institutions whose purpose is to provide services for those who aim to travel to the United States and to get good education. That is, you want to share perspectives at a defining moment of the bilateral relationship. How has the perception on China changed over time?
I think that, a very important question. Let me focus on the Trump period, and then maybe make one broader comment. So there is this question, is Donald Trump different? Is Donald Trump unique, or does he stand for a change in America? I think there's a bit of both. So the part about Trump that is unique, I think, is twofold. One, instead of having a win-win view of the world, he has a win-lose view of the world. If China wins, the US must lose. I disagree with that. The second thing that's distinctive about Trump is that instead of having a polite relationship in public with maybe more forceful negotiations in private, which is how prior US administrations have approached China, Trump wants to do everything in public. So in that sense, Trump is unique, is distinctive, but I think people in China have to understand that there actually is more of a consensus position that I would describe as worried about China now than ever before. And I think there are two fundamental understandable reasons for that. The first one is China is just a much more powerful country. China affects everything in the world. If we compare, let's say, today from 2001 when China joined WTO, it's a different country. So China affects everything. Because China and the US are dissimilar countries, lots of differences, people are wary. But then the second thing is very domestic, and it's really the root cause of populism, I think, not only in the US, but in the whole Western world. Average people have not experienced improving material standards of living really for the last 2 decades. They're very unhappy about that. and they're blaming institutions. They blame New York, they blame Washington, but now they're blaming China too. And I think that underlying reality of China's rise, China is just much more important, coupled with the fact that average Americans aren't doing so well economically, that means there's a broader base to concern about China, which is why I think leadership is more important than ever, and two-way dialogue, people-to-people dialogue, more important than ever.
You know, Jeff, we have a different feeling about your comments. Politicians would look the other way around. Educators, as distinguished as you, may look the other way around. For example, there is undeniably a decline in the number of Chinese students, and Chinese parents would give a second thought as to whether they should send their children to the other side of the Pacific Ocean for good education because of the frosty mistrust between, for the lawmakers and politicians in the D.C. Therefore, what would you say to Chinese students and their parents that Wharton School is very different?
Yeah, we are very different. We haven't seen declines in interest in the Wharton School from Chinese students, and our Chinese students are incredibly high quality and so important to the institution. You know, you're here to be at a big conference which is led by, run by our Chinese undergraduate students, extraordinary students putting on a very large national conference. So what I would say to parents in China is we love high quality students. We want the best students from all over the world. The quality of Chinese technical education is so high that of course we have lots of super qualified students for Wharton coming out of China. So just in our selfish interest, we want to have world-class students from anywhere, and there are so many coming from China, point one. But point two, back to politics, now is the time for universities to go out of our way to be welcoming of Chinese students, because I do think that, you know, it's a cliche, but it's true. In a period of frictions, the best way to manage the frictions is to understand each other better. So I certainly am championing the globalization of the Wharton School, not only China, but through all other countries. And of course, for me, that's very personal because I'm Australian. I came to the US, it created incredible opportunities for me, and I hope I've given back something to the US. But I know that immigration has been so core to everything positive in the US. I think there's an immigration-innovation nexus which has been so powerful in this country. So the idea that we would slow that down, that we would turn our back on that, strikes me as just being wrong-headed right now. But back to the leadership point, you know, people, average Americans would say, well, it's okay for you at Wharton to have Chinese students. What about, aren't they stealing our jobs? Isn't Chinese innovation unfair? All of the criticisms that are out there. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining to average Americans what China really means. So that's the kind of thought leadership side of a business school. But back to your core point, the message I'd love people in China to know is that I personally love spending time in China. I love chatting with you. I love exchanging ideas. And the Wharton School is absolutely committed to deeper relationships in China, not reducing them.
At the very beginning of our program, you said wisely that given the difficulties between the two countries, it is even more important to share perspectives. But we need perhaps to learn how to put ourselves into the shoes of the other side.
Yes.
So is the United States very different from what it was under the presidency of Donald Trump? Because for many observers, the country is so divided. Yeah. Which side is the
very important observation.
Of American
so the U.S. is divided. The U.S. has been very divided for a long time. Trump is different in one way I haven't said already. You know, in the past, there have been a lot of criticisms from China, from both the left in American politics, from Democrats who've said that Chinese trade was unfair and they were concerned about environmental issues, as you know, and then from the right, people who are worried about China as a potential military rival of the United States. Up until Donald Trump, every other president has tamped down those criticisms, stood above politics and said, our longer-term strategic interest is in more engagement with China. Trump has taken advantage, I think, of the left critics of China on trade and the right hawks, the security hawks, to say, hey, we're all worried about China. So that's why I think leadership is so important. The US isn't, in that sense, a different country. But if I could just characterize, I think you used a really important expression, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, what we in English would call empathy. When I look, if I try to exercise empathy, US to China and China to the US, here's what I see. The US says China's development model is unfair. And China says it's unfair for the US to tell China what to do because there's more than one pathway to development. That fundamental unfairness, it's like a moral blaming, that we're morally superior to you is one way to perceive it. I think there's always been an element of that in US policy, but there's been more of a live and let live quality to prior American administrations. So I think we do need more empathy. I mean, the Chinese people need to understand why Americans think that government involvement in the economy is unfair. And Americans need to understand why Chinese people think that American criticisms of China are unfair. I think there's a lot of truth, actually, to both of those charges.
Leadership is an important part for your education, obviously. But the animosity is growing against the background of mistrust. What would you say to the next generation of American business executives and leaders about, say, the word cosmopolitan? An important part of our curriculum, particularly yours, is to let students become more critical, to train them for critical thinking, critical analysis. And an important part of that is to show sympathy for different voices. You keep different voices in the mind, give them a fair chance to argue. So it's difficult, it seems, for the Americans to accept a different voice.
This is also a very astute observation. I'm an American citizen, but I am willing to say that the US, I believe, has long been a parochial country. Now, I think the reason the US was parochial, there was a good reason for that, which is that for 150 years, the US has been a magnet for talented people from all around the world. Talented people have come here, ambitious people have come here, they've made contributions to society. Sometimes they've gone back to their home countries, but America didn't need to go to the world because the world came to America. Late in the last century, I think, the period of globalization, that changed. But America's first view to going to the world was, after the Cold War, we've won. So now all we need to do is to go to the rest of the world and tell them to be like the United States, right? I think in the 21st century, that's unacceptable. And I do like your word, cosmopolitan. I think the US needs to go from being a parochial country to being a cosmopolitan country. That not only requires empathy, it requires much more comfort with the notion that the US isn't always number one in everything. But that's also hard for Americans to accept because the US has been number one in almost everything for more than 100 years.
Our former president Hu Jintao said China was the number one for centuries. So no big deal for America to be first in so many areas. And therefore, that has become a point of, if not a tipping point in the bilateral relationship. China is doing what it can to live up to the expectations in the trade talks. For example, we have just passed the foreign investment law to level the playing field. Do you think this, as the good beginning to show sincerity, will minimize the negative impact of a trade war? And do you think this is a good beginning, or you think things will get far worse? What we see about the trade war is just a small tip of the huge iceberg. Okay, so two really important points. Is trade the tip of the iceberg? Very important point. But can I start with your earlier observation about President Hu Jintao? Whenever I talk about US-China, about the first thing I say is what we call the rise of China should be understood as the re-rise of China. That is the return of China to the position it's historically occupied. So if you look at the last 2,000 years of economic history, up until about
the Industrial Revolution, 1820, China was the largest economy in the world. Then, in the 130 years after the Industrial Revolution, the New World, led by the United States, grew dramatically and China didn't. So why China missed out on the Industrial Revolution, I think, is a fascinating and important question, and I know something that a lot of economic historians in China work hard on. But the reason I think there are two important reasons to acknowledge China's economic preeminence for thousands of years. The first one is it's respectful to Chinese people because you have civilizational history, not 200 years of history, and we need to acknowledge that. But the second is, again, this is short-termism in the US. American history, we're in Philadelphia. American history began in 1776, Declaration of Independence. Then
right here in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. That's our worldview, is at most 250 years. Then we look at 5,000 years of Chinese history. We discount all the other history. We just focus on this period, and we focus on the period in which the US rose to global preeminence and China was at its lowest ebb. So I think that notion, the notion that we're witnessing the re-rise of China, the return of China to its historic place, is something that everyone in the West needs to understand better, and we don't see it because we have a very narrow view of history. So I hope you'll forgive my discursus on our understanding of history. With respect to the specific question about ending the trade war, I actually think there are three big economic issues. Trade's only one of them. So ending the trade war, I think we can do that. But you mentioned the recent changes in foreign investment law in China, and I think they're incredibly important because the second, if trade is the top issue in terms of political prominence, the most important economic issue, I think, today is what I would call market access, where American multinational firms love the Chinese marketplace, but they don't want to have joint ventures with Chinese companies. They want to have more protections for intellectual property. And I certainly am very thankful to the Chinese government for taking the lead, actually, on reducing the restrictions on foreign ownership, for example, in Chinese entities. You know, when Elon Musk opens Tesla in Shanghai, it's going to be 100% Tesla. It's not going to be a Tesla SAIC joint venture. Then the third level of issues, the hardest ones, are about innovation. And I think innovation is the hardest issue for two reasons. One, we're talking about the rest of the 21st century economy where innovation is going to be the key word, so of course there's competition there. But the second issue with innovation, and we see this in the case of Huawei, is that all modern technology can have two uses. It can have a commercial use, but it potentially has a national security implication as well. So I hope we can get through trade. I think we can do market access, but ultimately I think the hardest issues are going to be the who controls innovation and how do we understand that.
Good question. You are watching Dialogue with Geoffrey Garrett, Dean of Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania. We are so happy to be invited and do this program right here in the famous city of Philadelphia. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, sir. This is a city that has a lot of stories, interesting ones. For example, the rivalries between Hamilton and Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. Now, the big battles between these two guys was one represents the importance of government, the other respect for individual liberty. It's the second that took the upper hand in the dogfight, and we were impressed by the story. Somehow, all the way I came here, I heard stories about similarities instead of differences between these two countries, United States and China. So when we go back to the story, the nasty story between these two great figures, do you think Hamilton somehow represents what we stood for and the importance of government, but Thomas Jefferson, when he won the battle, let's look at the rivalries between these two sides. Do you think we are repeating the story that this city went through between two landmark figures?
So that's interesting that you characterize Hamilton as government and Jefferson as liberty and markets. I think that's one dimension, but actually if you look at that history, it was really about the control of the central government versus the states. So Hamilton was a centralizer, Jefferson was a decentralizer. In particular, he wanted the southern colonies to remain independent.
Jeff, this year witnessed the 40th anniversary of China's opening up.
Yes.
What we did throughout the 4 decades is somehow to gradually decentralize the central planning, and we have achieved tremendous success in doing that. So it's not just we are, the big fan of a central planning, central authorities. Everything is so central.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I mentioned before a misconception that Americans have about the rise of China, and I called it the re-rise of China. I think the
re-emergence.
Re-emergence, re-rise is just simple, but I agree. It's the return of China to the place it's historically occupied in the global economy.
But we are viewed, unfortunately, as being assertive. I mean, that's not a very pleasant word.
Let's hold that one aside. But on the other issue about the dynamism of the Chinese economy, why do people in the West not see that? I think the answer is what they see is the headline is growth slowdown, where inefficient state-owned enterprises are dragging the Chinese economy down. Now, there is some truth to the story about inefficiency in the state-owned sector, but I also understand why it's so hard to reform state-owned enterprises in China. But what that means is that we tend not to acknowledge how dynamic the Chinese private sector is, because we focus on inefficiencies in the state sector. So that's point one. And then point two, I think that the most extreme example of that is that people in the West don't understand how good and how innovative the Chinese technology companies are. Why? Well, we say, how can Tencent or Alibaba or Baidu be a world-class company because we've got the Great China Firewall and they don't have to compete against Google and Facebook? So there's some element to the fact that to the criticism that says they don't compete against Google and Facebook. That's true, but that shouldn't discount just how incredibly innovative BAT companies have been. So
and the most important, Jeff, they are good representatives of the private economy, the non-public sector, the most vibrant part of the Chinese economy.
Yes,
it is this part that the United States aspires to encourage. And ironically, Huawei has been singled out as a target.
Yes, so we can talk about Huawei for a second, but I do think that you've just made an incredibly important point. So if Americans were to accept that China is good at innovation, they would say, yes, but it's all been government-led. So the examples they would point to are things like high-speed rail or the move towards electric vehicles. But you're exactly right that when it comes to the technology companies, it hasn't been government-led. It's been bottom-up. It's been market-driven. And I agree with you 100% that people don't appreciate that enough.
Misunderstanding occurs when arts of humanities could also be misunderstood. For example, the closure of Confucius Institutes in the United States, that delivers a very bad message to China. That is a very bad warning, early warning about the advent of a frosty winter. So are you confident that exchanges between peoples would not be stemmed, would not be stopped, and the spread of Chinese culture would not be viewed as hostile in an attempt to change or if not subvert American leadership?
Am I confident on the University of Pennsylvania campus and at the Wharton School? Absolutely, yes.
Confucius Institutes?
Yeah, well, Confucius Institutes, I don't know the details of them. When I was in Australia, we had several Confucius Institutes, and I was involved in some of them. I don't know the cases in the US, but so first question, do we at the University of Pennsylvania and at the Wharton School want to know more about Chinese culture, history, and Chinese people? Absolutely, yes. In the current environment in the US, are some of these Chinese initiatives likely to be symbolic and that therefore they'll rise to the level of politics and people will criticize them? Probably also yes. I think one thing that we might start looking forward to is how will the China issue, if there is such a thing, affect the presidential election next year in the US in 2020? And I actually don't think China will be a big issue in the election for a tactical reason that Trump will have claimed a victory against China in the trade war, and so no one will want to criticize him on that.
Are you suggesting that President Trump is indeed eager and ready to sign the deal, to have a deal?
I think inside the White House and maybe inside the president's head, there are two voices. One voice I'd call an electorally pragmatic voice, maybe economically pragmatic too, that says, listen, you're actually going to get some important concessions from the Chinese government. Let's celebrate that. We'll call it a victory. And it would be a victory. And of course, no one wins from tariffs. So ending the tariffs is so important. And you know, things you've already pointed to about changes in foreign investment law, those can be viewed as a victory in the US. I happen to think they're good for China as well. So one side of Trump says, let's claim victory today, and that'll help me in my re-election bid. But then there's another side that maybe whispering into Donald Trump's other ear, the hawks, the China hawks in the White House who say, no, 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 we've got China on the ropes, now let's keep pressing China. This is, I think, the person with whom that view is most strongly associated is Peter Navarro, Trump's China advisor. And, you know, that doesn't look at all smart to me, because it's in our interest for China to tackle the economic challenges, the very real economic challenges that the country is facing as it transforms from high growth to quality growth. What I think President Xi Jinping wants to do right now is stabilize US-China so that he can focus on the big issues domestically in China. I think that's the right strategy for President Xi. I also think it's in the US's interest for that to happen, because China wouldn't, if the Chinese economy really had a so-called hard landing, that would not only be really challenging for China, that would be terrible for the United States and terrible for the global economy. So I just think there are real incentives just to cool things again right now, while acknowledging that there are big issues, and the one that I mentioned is innovation. We're going to have to settle those over time, but I think right now everyone just wants a little more calmness in the relationship. And if you look at the economic markets in 2019, they've become much more confident.
You were trained as a political scientist, and how could you land in business schools? I thought, I was toying with the idea, Jeff could have made a very good Secretary of State, because you are able to have empathy. You could think in the shoes of the other side. Tell me how important it is for you to utilize your academic training background as a political scientist, and yet you end up being an administrator of a business school.
Well, I don't know how I ended up being a dean of a business school. You'd have to ask other people about that. But in terms of my worldview, I think there's a big difference between how I think about problems and quote-unquote normal business school people do. Normal business school people think inside out. They tend to focus on corporations, on firms, and then go global. Because of my political science training, I go the other way. I start very global, and then I focus in. And you know, in the current period, I think that's not a bad place to be, because what's really happened in the last 20 years is that the triumphalism of the end of the Cold War, the Frank Fukuyama end of history, that triumphalism has been replaced by this incredible pessimism of the populism era. And those are big global phenomena. And I think in business schools we have to face the reality that business is viewed as part of the problem, not part of the solution. From my macro perspective, I see that the private sector and business, as we've been discussing, is absolutely part of the solution. And I think maybe I have a little more credibility in making that case because I'm not a finance professor. I'm not an accountant. I'm a political scientist by training.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure was all mine. Great to see you in Philadelphia.